Carrie?
Yep. Okay, I've got the right mic. Just need the pointer. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope you can all see. Feel free to scoot your chairs over if you need to. I want to talk about the Vermillion watershed. It's a watershed that's very near and dear to me. I actually live in Eureka Township in Dakota County, and I've been on my town board and also on the Vermillion Watershed Joint Powers Organization as an elected member because I've been on my township. And I think in my years of commuting up I-35 to the cities, I look at this twice a day, the headwaters of this watershed twice a day. And so I've been gathering data for about 35 years. I also was a mapping geologist with the Minnesota Geological Survey for 24 years, worked at the DNR and Eco Waters. And so, and also an aggregate. So I think about gravel and groundwater, surficial geology. And this is a story of what I think is happening there. You will not hear this anywhere else because this has been, forming in my own mind for these 35 years. But I want to focus on the headwaters because that is where the cold water comes in. I needed to start with this leveling understanding, though, of what groundwater is. I think you all know if you are trout fishers because the groundwater is, the water is expressed in all of our surface water features. I think a lot of people have this misunderstanding that our lakes and rivers sit on top of dry ground. But I think you have this fundamental understanding that the water underground is connected to our surface water features and feeds our surface water features. Wells that only go into the water table aquifer therefore can impact our surface water features by drawing down the water locally or lowering the water table regionally. But groundwater is just something that fell from the sky, some kind of precipitation, and that includes glacial meltwater. A lot of our water was recharged into the ground during the last ice age, and it's stored in the pores of sediment and rock primarily. I just gave a talk for people in Spring Grove, Minnesota, down on the Iowa border where there are caves and karst. There are larger chambers that host water down there, but for the most part, they're not underground rivers. You just have this water like a wet sponge, and the pores and how connected the pores are make it possible for the water to move through the sediment or rock, usually laterally and then maybe a little bit upwards into the surface. Because groundwater is insulated by that geologic material lying above it, it kind of averages out our annual temperature. And so our groundwater reflects our average annual temperature. This should cause you maybe a little bit of concern for cold water streams because right now our groundwater temperature is about 46 to 48 degrees, hotter in the Twin Cities where we put a lot of heat into the ground. And then of course, since temperatures are rising globally, the water temperature is inching up a little bit too. This is something else that I track because I use ground source geothermal heating and cooling for my house, so I know what temperature that water is as it comes into the house. So where this 46 or 48 degree water is connected to the surface, like in a stream like this where you see watercress, that is the definition of a cold water stream. You can see it in the winter because it's warmer than the surface around it, and in the summer because it's cooler. It pretty much just stays the same temperature. There are other places, though, where groundwater is confined by other non-permeable rocks or sediment on top of it. So you can have a layer that's not connected to a surface water feature. I won't go into that today, but that is kind of the more vulnerable and older water probably, but we don't see that as being expressed in surface water features. The age or the residence time of groundwater, it can be today's rain, it can be the glacial melt. I just gave a talk in North Mankato and looked up what their groundwater age was, 60,000 years old in North Mankato, where a data center is being proposed. So we have a very long residence time in part because sometimes the ice is pushing water deeper than it can flow down now, or because it's just had a very long flow path. So it might originate far from here and then slowly emerge in the Vermillion. I'm showing you this map of projects in the Vermillion watershed just to point out that the headwaters area along I-35, where those lines are thicker, the thicker lines are the trout stream reaches or the cold water reaches of the Vermillion. They all head up into this area by Elko New Market and Lakeville. And I would say that that's not where most of the projects of the Vermillion Watershed Joint Powers Organization are. And I think that that's an opportunity for you. I think there's some work that could be done there to protect those sources of cold water. There's a link here. So when you look at this later, I thought I might go into this link. You can look around at the VRWJPO's map a little bit. But I want to tell you the story of a farmer, Martin Diffley, who farms in that watershed. He's Gardens of Egan, if you've heard of their farm. They used to be in Egan. They moved down here to that kind of rectangular area. And he had a question for me about a line of boulders that was on his farm, really big boulders, like half the size of this room of boulders. And I was teaching at Carleton College at the time, and I had the students look into this question and address their answer in a letter to Martin Diffley, who was a friend. So I'll let you know that these were, some of them 2.6 meter diameter boulders, so 12 to 16 feet. And he had the question, did ice or water transport these to my farm and in this region? And these students actually tracked where they came from in Canada. Mostly they were moved by ice to this general area along I-35. But then it looked like a large flood came out of this last ice lobe in the area and lined these boulders up, kind of wrapped them around an outcrop of bedrock in the area, just kind of, they were a lag deposit. And they estimated, and again, this is a student project, very talented students, but take it with a grain of salt. They said that the flow that would have moved these boulders would have been moving 15 miles per hour. And it's about a third of how fast the river is now. And then the water itself was, I think, 6 meters deep. I have a slide later on that shows how deep the water was. So they came up with this massive volume of water. And then they're looking at me like, is that possible? Could this have happened? So now I'll need you back to look at the ice. I think you can tell where the ice went. I don't need to show you. It looks like somebody dragged their frosting through the finger of North America. That's the last ice advance that came down to Des Moines, Iowa. And the east side of that is where we are considering the Vermillion watershed. So you can see those last two ice advances very clearly through the Dakotas and Minnesota down to Iowa, the James Lobe and the Des Moines Lobe. Those are the ones in question. The Vermillion watershed is where this red oval is. So let's zoom in a little bit there. It's where this oval circle is. This is the trough, or this is the Minnesota River watershed mostly, but with a little of the Cannon and the Vermillion over here on the far right side of the screen. So these are at the edge of the last ice sheet that was here, the Des Moines Lobe. The watersheds are, and they were built by water that was emanating from that glacier. So here's our source. We can start to think about large volumes of meltwater maybe coming off this ice sheet. However, there's something unusual about these headwaters. And I'm going to keep locating you with this terrain map by trying to find that north-south line of I-35. I think you can see it a little bit in the terrain. And then this kind of high area in the middle that's kind of burnt orange colored, that's the Elko New Market area. So there's a low north of that, that's Lake Marion. And then there's a low to the south. I don't think that lake has a name. This is Chubb Lake down here, and Crystal Lake is another one of these lows in this general area. So if you drive from Burnsville south towards Northfield to the I-19 exit, you're going to cross the headwaters of the Vermillion watershed. And you can see that the green areas kind of go to the west, and then they end in these lakes or these depressional areas. This was the source of these big bursts of water that were moving the boulders that Martin Diffley has now stranded on his farm. And then that water came out and converged, and it looks like there's at least 3 or 4 different places where the water was coming out and converging and forming the big sand plain that's now the Vermillion watershed through, Farmington and onto the Mississippi. So we want you, this is person for scale on the right. I want you to imagine when you go down I-35 the next time that this is off to your west, and then the Vermillion's forming off to the east. Because that's what I do. And then those troughs that are kind of feeding the headwaters of the Vermillion were actually tunnels much larger than the tunnel shown here on the margin of the Greenland ice sheet. They were tunnels that were probably a mile wide as Lake Marion, as wide as Crystal Lake. And those were what were conveying all the water that was being pushed out from underneath that ice sheet. And it really did burst out kind of suddenly. The tunnels, once they're no longer filled with water, slowly close up because the pressure of the ice deforms it around the place where the water was flowing. So they were open momentarily and then closed up again. And this could have happened multiple times. This isn't as nearly as impressive as it was to stand there and hear the boulders bumping together and, you know, worry about the ice roof collapsing. But there are places on the margins of modern glaciers where there's actually water spouts coming up out of the ice. So what we think was happening and what the students calculated was this tunnel that was off to the west of I-35 was discharging and forming a fan at the headwaters of the Vermillion watershed. And here's where they say the velocity of the water was 6.7 meters per second, and then the water depth was 6 meters. 6 meters of water. This is about what you would see. This, if you multiply those and kind of get a volume of water per unit time or a flux of water, it's kind of puts you up here next to the some of these watersheds, the Orinoco, the Yangtze. If you don't know those rivers, bigger than the Mississippi at the mouth, that much water, creating the Vermillion watershed. And this was not the only tunnel system. This is not a great sketch, but give me a break. It was from 1996 when we didn't know how to draw things on the computer very well. And these are all the different margins of the Des Moines lobe, and all those little kind of parallel lines are places where I thought I saw tunnels like these. And so we're looking at a cluster of them over here on the right-hand side. These are very erosive events, and I think the most impressive ones are on the bottom of Lake Superior. They erode into the Bayfield sandstone up there and cross the upper peninsula of Michigan and emerge again in the north part of Lake Michigan and cut into the lower part of the lower peninsula of Michigan. Those are tunnels. Those are subglacial tunnels. So huge erosive events, big fans of sand and gravel at their mouths. And, oh, I thought this would show up a little bit better. This is I-35, and those vague kind of gray lines are places where we see valleys carved into the bedrock in this general area. So good thing I drew a line. This is the Vermillion watershed headwaters, the blue line, the arc east of I-35. And these lines go along the center line of the bedrock valleys. So it is clear that these eroded into the bedrock here. Not clear from my image, but clear from the data that I was able to look at. So as you're driving south on I-35, and after you get south of Buck Hill, I want you to start paying attention to big gravel pits, because those are the evidence of the fans, and then large troughs that are trending east-west. And the one I always notice has a sod farm in it. Does that ring a bell? Do you know where that one is? So you go down into this big depression, usually pretty icy. It's after the McStop, and you're headed down that steep valley. And then there's some more subtle ones as you go farther south. In Eureka Township, where I live, I think I have one more picture. Here's the ice margin, and those kind of rectangular depressions are the large gravel deposits that are being mined in Eureka Township right along one of the headwater streams of the Vermillion. I was on the town board when these were being proposed to go into the water table, and was able to get them to do quarterly monitoring of temperature, so we made sure that the gravel pits themselves weren't warming up the trout streams. The last piece of evidence, there's one farther south. Hazelwood is a little church that's kind of on I-35, another big depressional feature before you get to Highway 19. And there's actually, the orange line shows you the tiny little esker, or the tiny stream that's being deposited in the tunnel as it closes. And that actually comes right up towards my house. It took me a long time to figure this out. It took me those images, the 2 meter resolution topography. So this is what we're looking at there, the tunnel with its valley, with its esker filling it, and then a fan at the margin. There's a lot of data to support this, but I drew this as a cartoon. So we see bedrock valleys filled with sand, and what this does, and the reason it creates the situation for groundwater to come to the surfaces. Normally that groundwater would be just flowing laterally through the bedrock, but because there's a depressional feature, now we have water able to move up through the glacial material on top of the bedrock and come to the surface. And so there are springs all over the headwaters of the Vermillion that are supporting the headwaters region. I think there are some calcareous fens that have not been recognized, and there's certainly some problematic places where people just this season were excavating along the interstate and water just started coming out of the ground, and it came out all season. They weren't able to do anything with it. So Crystal Lake near Buck Hill is the place of a known fen. Murphy Hanrehan is a newly recognized fen there. I-35 again, Buck Hill is that little kind of pimple there on the north side of the trough. It's a place where the tunnel eroded into bedrock, and now calcium-bearing bedrock aquifer water is coming to the surface and feeding this rare wetland feature called a fen. These are protected, especially protected by law in Minnesota. Mostly we know them along the Minnesota River Valley. This is a newly identified one. And I think if we looked at some of these wetlands in Newmarket Township, we would find that they have the same chemistry and are also sourced in the bedrock. That's a project I have in mind recommending for the next group of Carleton students that I interact with. So groundwater also cools surface water. You can find springs this time of year or in the summer using thermal imagery. This is from Greg Brick's work. So he was looking at this in the winter, so a very cold winter day, like 0, and so the spring looks warm. So this is a really powerful technique you could use in a low-flying, drone or something to look for these springs. It's a project I would suggest. Greg has done some spring inventory here he looks like he drove the road north of Lake Marion and found a whole bunch of springs there. Makes sense to me. He's found a whole bunch on my property because I showed him where they were, but he hasn't done a lot of work in between, and that funding went away from the LCCMR. So I think a lot more could be done. The threats to the water in this headwaters area, well, Elko New Market is where the Niagara water bottling plant went in. In fact, when they were building it, there were springs coming up all along the land they were grading to put the plant in. This is Elko New Market's Erin Brockovich. This is Janelle Kuzna, and she's been working to kind of bring this to light, the issues to light, that Newmarket Township no longer just uses the amount of water for their city, but they've actually almost tripled the volume that they pump there, put it into plastic bottles and sell it at Walmart. So decreasing groundwater in the headwaters is a threat to the water coming into the trout streams because you create a cone of depression initially that then will lower the regional water table and affect the ability of that water to come out of the ground and feed the streams. And the other threat, I would say, for streams like this that are kind of at their thermal limit, kind of very close to their thermal limit, that anytime you decrease the groundwater contribution while you increase the runoff, and in these areas you have the Air Lake Airport, a lot of distribution facilities going in around that, like for, I don't know, Amazon, who knows, there's a lot of big box kind of buildings out there where the water is hitting that concrete and running off in a summer storm and doesn't have time to equilibrate its temperature. So I think there are some vulnerabilities here in that headwaters area. There is not a lot of projects, and there's a lot of land that could be protected and conserved. I think habitat starts at the headwaters. Right. That's it. Thank you.
I can make this thing is
Oh, wow. Does Lucas know that?
All right, are you ready for me?
Yep.
All right, sounds great. I'll share my screen. Okay. Can you all see my screen there? All right, awesome. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me tonight. Really excited to speak with you all about this. As I said, my name is Lucas Rhodes. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Been with NRDC for about coming up on.
Lucas, wait a little bit. We cannot see the screen yet.
Oh,
Just
okay.
give us a moment.
Sure.
We can see it on Zoom.
Okay. So, okay, working on Zoom, but not in the main audience at Fat Pants. So our technology folks are working on that right now. So while they're trying to figure this out, before I forget, so we got the Paul Johnson flies, and so we give that to somebody that is here in person. And I've got the list of names there, and there's a problem. My name is never on that list. So we've got, I might butcher your name, I'm sorry. Mika Rentschler. So it needs to be Micah, isn't that what I said? Micah Rents, Rentschier. The person needs to be there and here in person. Going once, twice, three. Okay, well, I'll go to the second name. Robert Richardson. Okay, Robert, you're the winner. Come and get your flies. Hey, congrats. Yeah. So the tire is back there, actually. Paul is right in the room. Thank you, Paul, for coming tonight. Thank you for the flies. So somebody made a suggestion earlier to close the screen, reopen the screen. Who was that? Okay, maybe if you could go check if you can assist. Don't press the reboot button. That's not the solution. IT always tell me that. Just reboot your computer. Wow. Getting close. Thank you. Okay, so how about folks online? Can you still see the presentation? You see it yet?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay,
see.
so we're set in the room as well. Lucas, sorry about this. You can get started. Thank you.
No worries at all. Yeah, happy to jump right into things here. So I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about neonicotinoid pesticides, commonly called neonics, because that's a real mouthful. And I definitely want to emphasize the impacts that these are having on aquatic ecosystems and mayflies and trout, and we're going to talk about that. But I'm going to talk about a few things first to just kind of give some more context and give you a sense of the full scope of effects that are stemming from neonate contamination in Minnesota. Um, and I'm going to start with pollinators because this is really the first thing that we recognize that there was a problem stemming from neonics. And pollinators, you might know, we've got bees, beetles, butterflies, birds, bats, don't know why they all start with B, but they do. They're extremely important, not just to ecosystems, but to agricultural systems. It's estimated that about 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat are we can thank our insect pollinators for those foods. So extremely important. But our pollinators are in pretty serious trouble. Um, Back in the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005, that's when we first saw honeybee colony losses across the country just skyrocket. Beekeepers were used to losing maybe 10 or 15% of their colonies each year, and suddenly they were losing upwards of 40% each year. And you can see that's kind of become the new normal over the past 2 decades, that beekeepers are losing 40, 50% of their colonies each year. Just last year, the most recent monitoring period was one of the worst years on record in Minnesota. Beekeepers lost about 74% of their honeybee colonies. So it's incredible, particularly compared with those historical numbers. Um, so it's worth noting that honeybee populations are relatively stable because they have an entire industry built around breeding and replacing those lost colonies and making sure that colonies persist. You can't say that for the 4,000 species of native bees across the U.S., about 400 of which are in Minnesota, and that includes the rusty patch bumblebee, which is Minnesota's state bee, which has declined by about 90% since the 1990s. Here you can see the historical range of the bee, and now it's just those little yellow patches and some of the purple patches are where they exist now. The Twin Cities is one of the few remaining strongholds for the rusty patch bumblebee. And just to underscoring again that pollinators aren't just things that we might like to see, in nature. They're really crucial for our food systems. We have studies showing that nationwide, important food crops like apples, cherries, and blueberries are already limited by a lack of wild pollinators. So that means if we keep losing pollinators, yields of those crops are likely to decrease. Another study concluded that worldwide, the loss of pollinators has decreased fruit, vegetable, and nut production by about 3 to 5%. And that loss of healthy, affordable food is either creating situations of malnutrition in some communities, and in other communities, especially in the US, shifting people from eating those healthy foods to eating a lot less healthy things. That's contributing to preventable deaths and a lot of disease and other things, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and certain cancers. So bottom line is we need to be, doing everything we can to save these pollinators. So here's where we get to why are pollinators disappearing? There are a lot of factors for sure. There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's disease, there's parasites. But the one that I want to talk about today, and that now we have 20 years of research that identifies as really a driving factor behind these pollinator declines, are neonicotinoid pesticides. Again, neonics. So like I said, there's a lot of factors that contribute to pollinator declines, but there's one that lines up almost perfectly with that loss of honeybees starting in the mid 2000s. So this is a map of this is one metric of the toxicity of U.S. agriculture to insects. So the light blue bar that you can see there is the toxicity stemming from just neonicotinoids. The dark blue bar on the bottom that you can hardly see, that's the toxicity stemming from all other insecticides used in agriculture. And you can see there's this enormous spike in toxicity, and particularly that light blue bar, starting right around the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005, when we saw that spike in honeybee colony losses. Now, certainly, this alone does not prove that neonics are driving pollinator losses, but it's one of the lines of evidence that we have. We'll talk about more. So there are 3 concerns with neonics, even compared with other classes of insecticides. And the first is that they are just extraordinarily toxic to insects, especially bees. If you just take one corn seed and coat it with a neonic pesticide at rates approved by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, you'd have enough insecticide to kill 250,000 bees, one corn seed. So just incredibly toxic in really small amounts. Second, this is where we start to get into aquatic contamination. Neonics are really good at at working their way through the environment. They're persistent, meaning they're long lasting in the environment, and they're also highly water soluble. So if you apply neonics to a field or to your lawn, they're not going to stay there. They're going to migrate through the environment and they're going to wind up in surface waters and groundwater. And third, neonics are likely the most widely used insecticides in US history. The scope of their use is just incredible. They're the most popular insecticides in the US right now. Most of their use is on farms, but they're also used in lawns, home gardens, all sorts of places. Basically, if you can think of a place where you might use an insecticide, there is almost certainly a neonic for that purpose. So this is a map of one of the types of neonics and its use between 2003 and 2014. As you can see, that dark brown color indicates really high levels of use, and there's a huge expansion in use between 2003 and 2014, especially in your heavy corn and soy regions of the upper Midwest. You know, in the right in 2014, you can see uh, probably a third to a half of Minnesota is covered in that really dark, that dark brown color, indicating heavy neonic use. And what drives this huge expansion in use is the adoption of neonic seed treatments, especially in corn and soybean. So these are, as the name might suggest, these are crop seeds that are pre-treated with a mixture of chemicals prior to planting. And so today, nearly 100% of conventional corn grown in the United States is grown from a seed treated with a neonic. Soybean, it's a little bit less prevalent. We don't know exactly how much, but probably about half of soybean is grown from a neonic treated seed. And so in Minnesota, if you use those statistics, that works out to about 12 million acres of Minnesota farmland that's sown with neonic treated seeds. So as a result of these chemical properties and the widespread use of neonics, we are seeing them just everywhere in the environment. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture has detected neonics in groundwater, in surface water, and even in rainwater in Minnesota. An independent study from a few years ago from the U of M found that about 97% of surface water samples had neonics in them. Then if you look at MDA, again, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, if you look at the sites where they're regularly sampling, 95% of those sampled sites have neonics in them. That's surface water. Neonics are also showing up in wildlife. So the Department of Natural Resources conducted a study gathering harvested white-tailed deer from hunters in 2019 and 2021. 2019, 61% of those deer had neonics in their bodies, specifically in their spleen. Excuse me. And then in 2021, just 2 years later, 94% of the deer collected had neonics in their bodies. So this is a worsening contamination problem. And these are having all sorts of effects on ecosystems. I already touched on pollinators a little bit, just touch on it briefly again. Again, just lethal to bees in extremely small amounts. Even lower amounts can have sublethal effects on bees' ability to reproduce, their ability to fight off disease and parasites and other things. So just really, really bad for bee populations. Couple studies in 2024 that specifically link neonic use with declines in wild bee populations and with declines in monarchs in the Midwest. There's a serious concern that they are also contributing to the collapse of aquatic ecosystems. So neonics are extraordinarily toxic to aquatic invertebrates. So these are your, mayfly larvae, other invertebrates that fish, birds, reptiles, all these wildlife feed on. And neonics are very commonly found in Minnesota waters and waters around the country at levels that we can expect to be causing harm to these aquatic invertebrates. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency sets thresholds above which you can expect harm. And that's what we're seeing. Levels exceed that threshold very regularly. So mayflies are among some of the most sensitive aquatic insects to neonics, and so for that reason, declines in mayflies that I'm sure some of you have witnessed in recent decades, and certainly there are a lot of studies showing that mayflies are declining, and neonic contamination is linked with those declines, and you'd expect that based on the lab studies showing their susceptibility as well as the levels of neonics that we're seeing in Minnesota waters. So this is just a quick case study from Japan, where neonics were introduced to the area surrounding a fishery in 1993. So in the top graph, it's a graph of zooplankton biomass. So these are your aquatic invertebrates in that ecosystem. Um, Pretty high, fairly consistent levels before 1993. After 93, neonics are introduced and zooplankton biomass drops off completely. Then you see below, these are a couple of the fish that were harvested from that area, eel and smelt, and basically the same story. You have stable populations before 93, neonics introduced, zooplankton biomass drops off, and so do those fish populations. Now, of course, that's Japan, that's not Minnesota, but the levels of neonics that are being found in Minnesota are similar to the levels that we saw in that Japanese fishery. And I want to highlight these are some findings from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. These are all quotes that are pulled from a letter that MDA sent to US EPA. I won't read them to you, but basically finding that they're consistently finding neonics in Minnesota waters, and concentrations are spiking during that corn and soybean planting period. They're often finding mixtures of neonics in individual water samples. And there's studies suggesting that mixtures of neonics can have what's called synergistic effects on aquatic invertebrates, meaning it's not just if you have 2 units of harm from one neonic and 2 units of harm from another neonic, the total harm is not 4. It's something like 5 or 6. It's a greater than additive harm to these organisms. And then again, just concluding that these pesticide-treated seeds are the cause of elevated and concerning concentrations of neonics in Minnesota waters. So a lot of cause for concern about aquatic ecosystems. Just noting quickly, they're also linked with bird declines. You may have heard that North America has lost about a third of its birds in the past 50 years. And in recent decades, neonics are linked with those declines, especially in insect-eating bird populations and also your grassland species. One study estimates that the neonics are contributing between 5 and 12% annual declines in those bird populations. And neonics can be directly toxic to birds, but they also, similar to the trout, neonics are wiping out the insects that they rely on as prey. Neonics also present serious cause for concern about human health, particularly for prenatal exposure to a developing fetus or to young children. So first of all, exposure is widespread. A study from 2016 by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found about half of Americans had neonics in their bodies, indicating recent exposure. A more recent study from 2022, this was a nationwide study looking at pregnant women, and 95% of those pregnant women had neonics in their bodies. So we're exposed through contaminated food, contaminated water. Conventional drinking water treatment methods do not remove all neonics, and also contact with treated areas. If your lawn's been treated with a neonic and you're walking on it or something like that, you can be exposed that way. So neonics are linked with a number of health risks. So studies of accidentally exposed human populations link neonics with birth defects of the heart and brain. Again, this is mostly prenatal exposure, autism-like symptoms, also things like decreased testosterone, these effects on hormones in the human body. And then rodent studies, and these are often conducted by pesticide companies themselves. Rodent studies link neonics with thinning of key areas of the brain, and a bunch of other reproductive and developmental and neurological harms. Now, the silver lining here is, neonic contamination is serious, it's a problem, but the vast majority of neonics entering the environment are coming from uses that are not necessary. And so the first category is treated seeds. So again, this is the by far the number one source of neonic contamination in Minnesota. Likely 12 million acres of corn and soy covered with these, um, but they're also used in potentially other crops. Um, and independent research consistently shows that the most common uses, specifically corn and soybean, they don't provide economic benefits to the farmers that are using them. And basically, the reason is these seeds uh, uh, provide a very short window of protection early in the growing season for a few weeks. Um, and that's not well timed to protect against the pests that actually provide economic damage to those crops. So a good example is soybean aphid. A lot of soybean farmers sometimes use neonic seed treatments to combat soybean aphid, but soybean aphid is a midsummer pest. And if you're using seed treatment that gives you that very early protection in May, maybe early June, that's before the soybean aphids are actually out and damaging your crop. Um, there's also loopholes in federal and state law, meaning that these pesticide-treated seeds are not regulated like other pesticides are regulated. So there's concern about that they're not tracked as much. Probably notice we don't know exactly where and when and how neonic treated seeds are used because of these loopholes. And a lot of these uses are wasteful. They're contributing a lot to contamination of the environment without actually providing economic benefits to the farmers that use them. If people are interested in like why people are using treated seeds, if they're not necessarily benefiting from them, I'm happy to talk about that in questions. The other category of unnecessary uses are on lawns and gardens. So these products are actually approved at higher per acre rates than in agriculture. So they're actually like more concentrated. There's more neonic in a small area. So they can create these toxic hotspots in highly populated areas like the Twin Cities. Again, these uses are preventative. They're often you put a neonic on your lawn at the beginning of the season, whether or not you know that there's actually a pest problem. And 90% of the time there is no pest problem, and so you've used a pesticide for no reason. And again, your neighbor's use matters. Even if you're not using neonics on your lawn, neonics don't stay wherever you put them. If your neighbor's using them, it's very likely that they're getting into your lawn and getting into your plants. So around the country and around North America, we have policy models for action to specifically address these unnecessary uses of neonics, while at the same time preserving potentially useful uses. That's redundant, but useful uses for farmers. So these aren't just outright bans like actually has happened in Europe, but much more targeted models for reduction. So the first model are lawn and garden prohibitions in New Jersey, Nevada, New York, and Maine, where they prohibited people from just putting these on their lawns, but there are exceptions for treatment of invasive species and other things like that. And the second model comes from Quebec, Canada, which in 2019 implemented what's called a verification of need program for neonic treated seeds. And so what this means is that for a farmer to use a neonic treated seed, they just need to demonstrate that they have a pest problem that would actually be addressed by these seed treatments. And if they can do that, and there are ways that they can do that with pest traps and other things, then they're able to use these products. But if they can't, then they need to use something else or not use an insecticide treated seed. And that was a huge success in Quebec. Neonic use plummeted, farmer yields remained high, um, That's actually been so successful that the government in Quebec is expanding that program to apply to other types of insecticide seed treatment. So New York and Vermont, just in the past 2 years, have passed legislation to follow suit and adopt a similar program. So it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to be implemented there, because both of those laws go into effect in 2029. So there are opportunities for a lot of neonic reduction here in Minnesota. Um, and sometimes people ask, like particularly coming from NRDC, we're a national organization, this is a national issue, so why are we working in Minnesota? And there are a couple reasons for that. So first of all, Minnesota is unique in that like probably 90% or more of the contamination entering the environment comes from those unnecessary uses, especially treated seeds. Other states where you have more large scale fruit and vegetable production. There are neonic uses there that are potentially benefiting farmers. They are also causing contamination. But here in Minnesota, the vast majority of use is unnecessary. And so there's an opportunity to get at those and really help your ecosystems, help human health. There's also more of a policy opportunity than other really big corn producing states like something like Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas. Much more opportunity for action in Minnesota. And what's really exciting is that if Minnesota were to take action, it could really serve as a model for other heavy corn and soy producing states in the upper Midwest. So it would be an incredible step forward for the country if Minnesota were to act. So there is a current bill. You can see the bill numbers on the screen there, that would create a regulatory program for pesticide-treated seeds and implements a verification of need program that's very similar to the one that I talked about in Quebec. And it would direct MDA, the Department of Agriculture, to develop this program and gives MDA a lot of discretion in terms of how they actually do that, to create a program that works for Minnesota farmers and that works for Minnesotans more generally. There is a new bill that we expect to be introduced in early 2026. That would be an even more targeted approach, really hones in on those two models that I talked about earlier, the lawn and garden prohibition, but then the treated seed verification of need program. And the current bill is a little bit broader and talks about some other things. So we're excited about that new bill in 2026. And so with that, I can stop sharing my screen and happy to hear thoughts, questions. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, we're forming a neonics committee. This in 20, we already started, but it's going to be a big focus for us in 2026 to try to impact based on all the discussion that Lucas shared with us. So it's very critical for us in Minnesota. So let's start the Q&A. So we'll start in the room. And if you have a question, make sure you say if it's for Carrie or Lucas.
So being a scientist that I am, we'll see if I can form this question correctly. So how long do the neonics stay in the environment? I mean, do you say they move a lot, so they get washed down the stream and end up in Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico, or do they stay local for a relatively long time?
Great question. So it depends on where they are. Um, So the things that can break down neonics, like light is one of them. But if a neonic is in soil, for example, the half-life, so the amount of time that it takes for half of the neonic to break down, can be in the years. It can be months or years that they remain in soil. Um, and so what happens is if you have year after year application in soil, they're sitting in that soil and then they're consistently just kind of being drawn off by rainwater, irrigation water, or anything like that. So there's kind of and then you get a pulse whenever you have it during the soybean plant or the corn planting season, like the MDA letter talked about a little bit. Um, and so, you're not talking about like forever chemicals like PFAS where they're going to last hundreds of years or something like that. But we are talking about months or years at a time. And that's a significant time period for something to be sticking around in the environment. Once it's in water, generally, I think it breaks down a little bit faster than in soil, but we're still talking about weeks that it's going to remain in that water. And if there's a constant source entering the stream, you can have long periods where neonics are present at high levels in water.
Okay, we have another question here.
So if I'm at Home Depot, how do I know which of the products contain neonics and which ones don't?
Great question. So you'd have to look at the active ingredients in the product. So the pesticide is not going to say contains neonicotinoids or neonics. It's going to have the specific chemical active ingredients. And I can put those in the chat, and I can also share them with Bob or someone else for them to share with you all, so you know what to look for. Because unfortunately, you just have to look for these active ingredients.
We have two questions here. I'll start with this gentleman over here.
The question I have is, in talking to farmers that are planting corn, particularly, that I've heard from them when we've talked about neonicotinoids that they cannot purchase corn that is not treated. And if there isn't even the option for them to go, if they're going to plant corn, it's going to have neonicotinoids in it. Has anybody gone to the companies to give them an option, give them or put some pressure for the companies to produce something that is an alternative for the farmers? Otherwise, it's not going to go away.
Right. And so this is a huge issue in the treated seed area. And it's made worse by the fact that, so I think 4 companies supply upwards of 80% of corn and soybean seeds in the US. So it's these huge multinational companies controlling the supply chain. Some of those companies also manufacture neonics themselves. And so, like you said, what they do is they take the seeds that farmers want, that have the traits that farmers want, and they package those seeds with these chemical treatments. And so when farmers go to their seed dealer, they're getting seeds that have neonics on them, whether they actually need them or not. And it's especially true in corn, that it's much harder to find untreated seed, though they are out there. A farmer would probably have to use a different hybrid, and we understand that can be difficult in a lot of circumstances. To my knowledge, the companies that manufacture seeds have expressed no interest or willingness to shift their supply chains to expand the options for untreated seed. Generally, farmers can, if they call their seed dealer early enough in the season, they can ask the chemical or the seed provider to not treat seeds. That's tougher with corn because it's treated so high up in the supply chain. But the short answer to your question is we don't expect seed companies to address this. We don't expect them to decrease rates of neonics on the seeds. We don't expect them to increase their untreated options, in part because they're able to charge a premium for these technologies that they are supplying to farmers in this package. So they're charging farmers more for products they probably don't need. Really problematic. But what we've seen in Quebec, things were very similar before the verification of need program in Quebec. Farmers, chemical companies, everyone was saying, whoa, if you impose this program, we're not going to be able to find any corn seeds. But as you might expect, once the regulatory system changes, those seed companies, the chemical companies, react pretty quickly. I think Quebec has something like 1 million acres of corn, so that's pretty small compared to Minnesota. No seed company is going to walk away from the market created by 8 million acres of corn, 8 million acres of soybean. We would expect, and we've talked with some seed companies who similarly would suspect that if the regulatory system changes where there's much higher demand for untreated seed, seed companies are going to expand those selections. But we think regulatory changes is necessary to get there.
You mentioned impact on human health, and I thought I saw the word autism in there. And it seems there's somebody in our government who thinks autism has accelerated. And I wonder if it might be connected to neonicotinoids.
So I want to be very, very clear here that we do not know that neonics are causing autism or anything like that. I realize autism is thrown around in a lot of contexts. It's a very complex issue. But there is a high quality study that finds that basically looking at parents of children with autism, and those parents self-reported like what kind of pesticides did they use on the property while they were pregnant with their children, things like that. And there is an association between higher reported rates of neonic use and higher incidence of autism. So there is a connection there, but I want to be very careful to say like there is not, you know, solid evidence that neonics cause autism. There's just this causal relationship that is definitely worth exploring further.
Okay, would there be a question for Carrie? I have a question for Carrie. So how about underground water? So what can we do to help out protect that underground water?
I'll just talk into this one. I was going to say something about neonics and groundwater in Minnesota. At the Minnesota Groundwater Association meeting, Bill Arnold from Civil Engineering gave a good talk on that. Consider having him if you don't see him at the Neonic Symposium in January. He's looking at neonics and the degradates or the breakdown products. But to protect groundwater, use surface water. Really, groundwater is kind of a rare commodity. It's slow to recharge. We need to pay attention to how much we're withdrawing and make sure it balances what's coming in. And in some places, I mean, in the Twin Cities metro area in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we drink the Mississippi River because we can track that better. We can make sure we're not drawing it down. And if you look at the Great Lakes region in general, most of our major metropolitan areas are drinking surface water features, Great Lakes or Great Rivers. You can't really move your suburbs too far out away from surface water sources and expect that to be sustainable because the groundwater just doesn't recharge that fast. We're looking at places where we can manage the recharge a little better, not pave over places where water is soaking in, maybe intentionally try to direct water back into the ground, even pumping it in if it's treated well. So those are some things to do. And drink your surface water and not your bottled water. Yes.
The guy with the ugly sweater has a question.
You can still drink beer.
Yes, my question is, what do you think of my sweater? No, actually, Carrie, you mostly talked about the headwaters of the Vermillion, but there's actually a really important cold water tributary farther downstream, the south branch of the Vermillion.
Yes, there is.
And we've heard talk that there is a proposed data center
Right.
in the headwaters of the south branch of the Vermillion.
Yep.
And we're wondering if you had some comments about what you thought might be the effect on the thermal impact on the south branch if a data center comes in.
When I first heard about this is on Highway 3 in Farmington. There's a golf course there on the east side of the road, and they're proposing to put a data center on the entire golf course, kind of up against the homes that are there. I think it's impacting hundreds of private well owners that are not connected to Farmington city water. So they're concerned, but then also the groundwater entering the Vermillion there is a concern because that's sand over sandstone. It looks like it's all kind of fairly well connected, the surface water, groundwater. So their wells may be 200, 300, 400 feet deep. They're using the wells, I think, they're using the city of Farmington's wells, but it could potentially impact the recharge of the stream. I don't think that kind of modeling was done. They weren't testing to see if that was going to potentially happen. This kind of came in under the radar when we weren't understanding what data centers were asking for because they were going straight to cities. And cities were signing non-disclosure agreements and not talking to the DNR about what this would potentially do to surface water features. That is a charge of the DNR. That is something they care about. But this process bypassed their input. So we've done some things at the legislature this last session to improve that so that the DNR is consulted early on. But unfortunately, Farmington slipped through. I know that there's a very well-formed citizen group there, Coalition Against or for Responsible Data Center Development. They have even somebody who's worked on data centers in their citizen group. And they're organized in a way that they could use some money, by the way, because they're suing Farmington, as is Castle Rock Township. So that's kind of what's happening now is these towns that got out ahead of it, ahead of the legislation, it's citizen groups that are suing their cities or their surrounding cities to try to stop the data center development. Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is also suing the way some of these processes, suing the cities for the way the processes happen. So where you can support those groups, that's their only chance right now.
Hold on a second, I will, because we need the people online to hear your question.
It seems like it's really well known what the usage could be potentially and all this other stuff. I mean, those things are put into plans. How much will you need? What's going to be used? It seems like the weak link in the whole thing is actually understanding and knowing how the underground system works, whether or not there's recharge, whether or not the aquifers can stand these kinds of drawdowns. And that, it seems like you've been studying this for 35 years. Does that take a long time to develop that? Or is this something that the DNR can look at data and basically say, yes, it's a fit, or no, it's not a fit?
Well, the DNR wasn't asked in this case. The development is proceeding because the city agreed to it and the DNR was left out of the decision. In the 7-county metro area, we have a really robust groundwater model that was created by the Metropolitan Council with a lot of wonderful data. And so, yes, you could use the groundwater model that the Met Council developed and say, put a pumping center here, what will that do to the streams? So that's answerable in the 7 counties. It's not answerable in the rest of the state. We don't have models like that. But unfortunately, Met Council was not asked that question, nor was the DNR. So it was a failure of the process.
Were there just some changes with the EPA affecting, I don't know if it's groundwater, swamps? I mean, the whole flow of the water system has been questioned or something and changes have been put into effect?
Yeah, so you're talking about, I think, what's considered a water of the United States.
Okay.
WOTUS, they call it that. And there have been changes at the federal level that will affect other states because they have weak state regulation. But Minnesota took the charge of water on, and our agencies, not the EPA, but our Board of Water and Soil Resources and our DNR and our Pollution Control Agency, they all assumed some of this federal regulation and put it into state statute. And so we're protected in ways other states aren't because we have this other local level of protection. So we're not worried about the delisting of certain rivers or high up in the watershed tributaries that were considered waters of the United States. It's not going to impact us that much. So you have other bigger worries. I'd say take that one off your list.
Thank you, Carrie. We're going to do some questions from the online participants. And right now we'll start off with questions for Lucas. Thank you, Lucas, for, and we know you're in another time zone, and we appreciate you staying on here. First question, I think came to a lot of people. One seed, the toxicity of the insecticide could take out 250,000 bees. And so the question was around dosage is how did the companies come up with the dosage for a particular seed? Is there any route to actually just reducing the dosage on a particular seed and reducing the impact on the environment from that avenue?
It's a good question, and it would be really difficult because as much as yes, like there's an enormous amount of toxicity on one seed, but the actual amount of the pesticide that is on that seed is already very small. The problem isn't the amount applied to the seed, it's how extraordinarily toxic that chemical is. Um, and the amount that the companies recommend that farmers apply or that the seed dealers apply, that's calculated based on excuse me, um, what they feel is going to be effective to protect that plant. And I'm sorry, I didn't explain this, but one of the things that makes neonics unique is that they're designed to be absorbed by the plant. And so and then they're distributed throughout the plant. They make the whole thing toxic. So you have to have enough of the toxin for it to get into the plant and get all over the place and still have enough of the toxin in those individual areas that it's enough to kill insects. So I think it would be really, really difficult to reduce the level to a point that it would actually make a difference ecologically, while still having any of the protective quality that the seeds currently have.
Okay. I know you said in Europe that the neonics were banned some point in the past. What data is there that indicates that there's been a drop in the environment, and does it matter if it's in the water or the soil? Does it change what its half-life is in water versus on land itself? Just what happens when in the wishful case where they stop using it in the US?
Yeah, so like I said, they're not forever chemicals. Within a few years, you should see a significant drop. I don't know I haven't seen specific data about like environmental levels of neonics in Europe, but I assume they have dropped very, very significantly because they have banned pretty much all outdoor uses of neonics, and they did that in 2018. And what I would say is that actually we saw one of the first studies come out just in the last month or so that bird populations are starting to rebound or have increased for the first time in a long time since that neonic ban was put in place in Europe. Um, so it takes time for neonics to leave the soil to break down. I would say, given all the different mediums, it'd be a few years probably. Um, but they can leave and it can really give an opportunity for birds, trout, all sorts of wildlife to rebound. So there is hope.
Thanks. What about regional differences? You showed in the map the change from, I don't know, 10 years ago to now in terms of the use of these insecticides in the Midwest primarily. But there are regions like the North Shore and other areas where it's not used because there's no crops grown there. Do they still detect neonics in the areas where it's not even used because of the way, water can move and soil can blow around?
So there definitely are regional differences in detection levels. The like the upper Midwest in like specifically in your corn and soybean growing regions, that's where you're seeing the highest levels in water, the highest frequency of detections, and in other types of agricultural areas too. So you see lower levels in more natural or non-agricultural areas. Um, you still see wildlife contamination, like the deer study that I mentioned before from the DNR. looked at deer that were harvested all over the state, like including very non-agricultural natural areas, and even those deer had neonics in their bodies. And so that might just be because those deer themselves obviously are moving around and they might be drinking contaminated water in certain areas. But short answer, there definitely are regional differences. They're not completely pervasive, but they certainly are. They get around a lot in the environment.
It's back to Neonics 101. What are the targets for these? What are the pests that are the primary targets?
So they target a lot of soil pests that can feed on the roots of young plants or sometimes the seed themselves. So like corn rootworm, armyworm, other types of grubs are the main targets. But then they also can be used to target certain pests that eat the leaves and the stems of plants too.
All right. And are there, oh, I think I know the answer is this, why farmers can't use part of their yield in the next batch of crops. I think that's because it's illegal, right? They can't use their own seeds from what they grow for a whole different other intellectual property reason.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the just insane things about the seed market is like, yes, some seeds are sterile, so you can't plant them, but also you're prohibited because you're using one of those four companies that I talked about. You're using their intellectual property without their permission if you were to breed and plant those seeds. So that's a whole other problem. But yeah, farmers are not able to do that.
And I think we'll finish with this one, which is a good one for us to think about. You have, there's another bill coming in 2026 for the state of Minnesota. What kind of odds do you give it for likelihood of success? Is this going to be something that's a multi-year effort, or are you thinking that we have maybe a year or two?
I would expect that it is a multi-year effort still at this point. It has already been a multi-year effort. I've been working on these bills in Minnesota since 2023. But what I can tell you is that every year that goes by, every year that you stay with this kind of advocacy, your chances improve. And you never know when something's going to change that gives you an opportunity to pass something that's really groundbreaking. And when that happens, you got to be ready to take advantage of it. And so that's what we're doing right now, building a broad coalition of people that really care about this. And I think we've been successful in that so far. It's a win to even be getting legislative hearings on these bills, and we've gotten that. Um, with that said, I think we still if I were to bet, I would not say we're going to pass this in 2026. But it's something that's worth fighting for. And I would just note the Birds and Bees Protection Act was the bill that I referenced that was passed in New York in the last 2 years. My colleague worked on that campaign for, I want to say, 5 or 6 years. And so that's in New York. But it's worth it. It's possible. And so, excited to be continuing to work on this.
You say, come over here? Okay, yes. Okay, lots